This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Avam. Welcome everyone. Parshas Matos. So Parshas Matos is one of those Parshas that's very neglected because it comes out during the 3 weeks, and most people are on vacation, most Rabbanim are on vacation. You can always cover up by giving a shiur on the 3 weeks, so it's one of those neglected areas of the Torah. So we want to focus on some very interesting aspects of Parshas Matos. Parsha begins with a very unusual introduction. Vayidaber Moshe al Roshei Hamatos. Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the heads of the tribes. Livnei Yisrael Leimar. Very interesting. So Moshe Rabbeinu is about to give a mitzvah to Klal Yisrael. This is the mitzvah of Nedarim, the mitzvah of Layachel Devaroi Klal Yisrael Yaseh. And for some reason, it's being introduced and being given to the Roshei Hamatos. All of a sudden, a mitzvah is given to the Roshei Hamatos. This is the only mitzvah in the whole Torah which is directed at the heads of the tribes. Parshas Tefillin, the mitzvah of Tefillin is given Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Tzitzis, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Sukkah, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Shabbos, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Usually, all the Jews have to keep the mitzvahs. They're not special to the Nesiim. Why, when it comes to the mitzvah of Nedarim, is it being directed toward the Roshei Hamatos? This is the only place in Kol HaTorah Kula where any issue, any mitzvah is being directed to the Roshei Hamatos. So the Ibn Ezra has a very interesting approach over here. By the way, the Ibn Ezra at one part lived in Verona, so we were there very recently. And the Ibn Ezra says as follows. He says that often in Chumash, in Muktam and Mulchavat Torah, things are not necessarily in order in the Torah, but sometimes 2 episodes are directly out of order. For example, the Ibn Ezra gives is the episode of Miriam speaking about Moshe Rabbeinu, and then it says Vayiham Bachatzeros. Well, it's exactly out of order. So says the Ibn Ezra, that is the paradigm for what's going on in Parshas Matos. We could also ask, it's a big Torah out there. This is the mitzvah of Nedarim. Why does it take until Parshas Matos for the Rebbeinu to tell Klal Yisrael, you got to keep your word? This is something maybe we could have heard about in Parshas Yisrael, in Parshas Mishpatim. Why now, at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, all of a sudden, Rebbeinu comes to Moshe and he says, go tell Klal Yisrael, you got to keep your word. So Ibn Ezra says, very interestingly, at the end of the Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu is told that he has to distribute and tell Yeshua ben Nun to allocate Eretz Yisrael to the Shvatim. Whereupon 2.5 tribes come to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, we're not really interested in going to Eretz Yisrael proper. We like the land on the Transjordan. Let's take, there's enough land for our sheep and cattle on the other side of the Yarden. We'll suffice with that. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, what? You're going to go to Ever Yarden and Klal Yisrael are going to fight and you're not going to help them out? So they said, no, we're going to go into Eretz Yisrael. We're going to fight ahead of our brothers. And when we're done, when we've been successful in chasing out all of the Canaanim from Eretz Canaan, we'll go back to our families. So who was that directed to? So it says in Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Chav Ches, the end of the Parsha, Vayitzav lohem Moshe. Moshe commands them. Who's them? Eis Elazar HaKoyen, Ve'eis Yoshua ben Nun, Ve'es Roshei Avos Hamatos. That Moshe Rabbeinu tells Yehoshua, make sure Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, V'chatzi Yisrael Menashe abides by their promise. Make sure, he tells Elazar HaKoyen, he tells Yoshua ben Nun, and he tells the heads of the 12 tribes. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu telling the Nesiim to make sure that the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven abide by their deal? The answer is because the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven are really going ahead of the other 12 Shvatim in terms of taking their share of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore Moshe Rabbeinu says, they're stepping on your toes, so to speak. So you are formally in charge that the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven follow what they said. And at this point in time, if you look in Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Chav Daled, Moshe Rabbeinu says like this. He's saying this to Elazar HaKohen, he's saying to Yoshua ben Nun, and he's saying to the Roshei Avos Hamatos, Benu lachem orim latavchem, go ahead, build cities for your children. Ugadeiros l'tzaynachem, and build corrals for your sheep. V'hayoytse mipichem tasu. You better keep your word. B'nei Gad, B'nei Ruvain, Yehoshua, Elazar, you guy, Roshei Hamatos, keep your word. Keep your word. You cannot go back on what you promised. Meaning this is one area in the Torah which is directed at the Roshei Hamatos. That the Roshei Hamatos have to ensure that the B'nei Gad and B'nei Ruvain, they fight on behalf of the rest of their brothers, and only then could they go back and take possession of the Transjordan. And the lashon that Moshe Rabbeinu uses is the hayoytse mipichem yasu tasu. Oy v'azoy, says Ibn Ezra, following what Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Roshei Hamatos, the hayoytse mipichem tasu. So you might ask, why do I? They'll say, what do you mean we should keep our word? Where in the Torah does it say you have to keep your word? It doesn't say that yet. Nowhere in the Aseret HaDibros does it say you have to keep your word. It says midvar sheker tirchak. Look in the Gemara. The Gemara says talking about dayanim and their proceedings with the Balei Dinim, but nowhere in Kol HaTorah Kula has it yet said lo yachel devaroi. So following what Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Roshei Hamatos at the end of the Parsha, the Derech HaTorah is to begin a Parsha after the end of the Parsha. So you say, well, why would the Torah write it so backward? It's l'malam min hazman, it's l'malam min hateva. So following the end of the Parsha, Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Chav Daled, v'hayoytze mipichem tasu, which is directed at the Roshei Hamatos, the Parsha begins, v'yidaber Moshe, el Roshei Hamatos, l'bnei Yisrael leimar, zeh hadavar shetziva Hashem. That what? Loi yachel devoroi, kechol hayoytze mipiv tasu. This is the meaning of the beginning of this week's Parsha. Says the Ibn Ezra. Okay, so let us continue now. The second pasuk says like this. Vayidaber, the pasuk Beis, the beginning of the Parsha. Vayidaber Moshe el Roshei Hamatos, zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem. So look very carefully. Rashi says that the lashon that Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Roshei Hamatos is zeh hadavar. This is the matter. Very interesting expression. Zeh hadavar. Normally, when Nevuah is introduced, it's with the following expression: Koi Amar Hashem. So in this past week's Haftarah for the Navi Yirmiyah, Koi Amar Hashem Zacharti Lach Chesed Neurayach. That is the typical way. Yeshaya always introduces his Nevuah, Koi Amar Hashem. Yirmiyah, Yechezkel, Hosea, Zechariah, you name it, Nevi'im introduced their Nevuah with the word Koi. However, Rashi points out, not Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu introduces his Nevuah, with the word Zeh. Says Rashi, take a look at this Rashi, Moshe nisnabe b'koi. Moshe would prophesy with the word Koi. When Koi Omar Hashem kachatzois halayla, v'haneviim nisnavu b'Koi Omar Hashem, and the Nevi'im also prophesied with Koi. Moshe aleya Moshe. Moshe had an added dimension. Shenisnave b'loshen zeh hadavar. Moshe not only prophesied with Koi, Moshe prophesied with zeh. So if Moshe prophesied with zeh, then why did he say Koi? Koi Amar Hashem kachatzois halayla. Make up your mind. What type of introduction did Moshe use? Did Moshe use Koi, or did Moshe use zeh? It sounds like Rashi is trying to say that Moshe Rabbeinu had a higher level of Nevuah. He didn't prophesy with the word Koi, he prophesied with the word Zeh. And yet Rashi begins that Moshe too prophesied with Koi, Koi Amar Hashem kachatzois halayla. And Bechlal, what's the difference between Nevuah Koi and Nevuah Zeh? Don't they mean the same thing? This is what Hashem says. Okay, so for this we have to see the Mizrahi. Rabbi Mizrahi, who lived from 1450 to 1525. He was born in Constantinople, now in Istanbul, in the year 1450. In the year 1500, he becomes the chief rabbi of Turkey. He's a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. We were just in the city of the kever of Rabbi Yehuda Mintz. It's very interesting. So just think for a moment. So he's the rabbi in Turkey in the year 1500, in the aftermath of the Spanish Inquisition. Many Jews who left Spain not only came to Italy, many came to Turkey. So he's in charge of absorption of all these Spanish Jews in Turkey, to the point where you could look in the Shas Chuvas Re'im that he gave up his responsibilities as Dayan and Rosh Hashiva for a year. That means he didn't give Shiur, he didn't teach. He was in charge for an entire year of just taking care of these Spanish Jews who had nowhere to live, no country to go to. This was his main occupation. And the Mizrahi writes in the Chuvas, Shas Chuvas Rabbi Mizrahi, that he felt very hurt and he felt burned by the Spanish Jews. Why? Because he writes, you can look in Shuvah Samach Vav, number 66, that these Spanish Jews, he writes this openly, spread a rumor about his son. He had a son, Gershon Mizrahi, and these Spanish Jews spread a rumor that he acknowledged Muhammad as a prophet. Now, if you in a Arab country acknowledge Muhammad as a prophet, and you don't then formally convert to Islam, well, that's the end of your life. And he had to flee, his son had to flee to the Medi island of Naxos, and he never saw his son again. And he writes, here he gave up his life for someone like the Mizrahi. His life is teaching Torah. He gave up his life to care for these Yidden, had nowhere to go to, and he felt like they burnt him. And it's almost like he can't contain himself. He has to eternalize the tsar that they caused him. You can look in Shuvah Samach Vav. Well, the job of the Mizrahi is to be able to answer the Ramban's kashas on Rashi. So whenever the Ramban has a kasha on Rashi, the Mizrahi takes up the responsibility to try to answer whatever questions the Ramban has on Rashi and to try to find the source for where Rashi's comments come from. So what the Mizrahi wants to do is Mizrahi first wants to define what's the difference between zeh and kai. It means the same thing. So the Mizrahi says, an idea that we mentioned pretty recently, that when a Navi receives prophecy, it comes through a prism, some kind of glass, kiviyachal. Now this prism could be a pristine, clear prism, or it could be a hazy, shady prism. Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah was crystal clear. It's called Asbaklaria HaMeira. Therefore, when Moshe Rabbeinu prophesied, he said, Zeh. Zeh means this exactly is what Hashem says. With no interpretation, with no confusion, with no haziness, with no degree of uncertainty. Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah was precise, and therefore he could say, Zeh hadavar. This is exactly what the Rebbeinu Shalom said. Masha'in Cain, Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, Yecheskel, and Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. David, all the Nevi'im, they had prophecy, and certainly Shekol Devreihem MS, Vatzedek, but nevertheless, they could not say Zeh Hadavar, this is exactly what Hashem said, because the prism through which they saw the prophecy was somewhat unclear. In fact, the Gra says, the Nevi'im Rishainim were Me'ira Shebe'ena Me'ira, the clear of the unclear, and the Nevi'im Achronim were Eina Me'ira Shebe'ena Me'ira, the unclear of the unclear. But there's a categorical difference between the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu and all the other Nevi'im. Moshe was able to say, Zeh, this is exactly what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants, and all the other Nevi'im were only able to approximate as much as humanly possible. So Frek the Mizrahi, so why does Rashi say Moshe Rabbeinu prophesied with Kai Amar Hashem, Kachatzois Halayla? Or, by the way, there are other times that Moshe Rabbeinu said Kai, says the Mizrahi. That's when Moshe was a novice. That's when Moshe was a rookie. That was early in Moshe Rabbeinu's career. He had not yet graduated to the level of Asbaklaria HaMeira. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, nobody is born a Moshe Rabbeinu. Even he had to work on himself. And at the beginning of his career, he started off in Mitzrayim. When Hashem told him about Makas B'choros, he also didn't have Asbaklaria HaMeira. He had Asbaklaria She'ina Me'ira. So when it came to Makas B'choros, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Kai Amar Hashem, or other prophecies connected to Yetzias Mitzrayim are all in Kai. But once Moshe Rabbeinu graduated to Asbaklaria HaMeira, He never turned back. He never was demoted. He retained the level of Asbaklaya Meira for the rest of his life. That's why Rashi starts off, Moshe Nisnabe B'Koi, that was in the beginning. The other Nevi'im were Nisnabe B'Koi, always. Moshe Alei Moshe, that he was Nisnabe in the Lashon of Zeh. When? After he received the level of Zeh. In the, if you look at number 4, in the Sifsei Chachamim, of course, is also another commentary of Rashi. He sort of clarifies that at what point in time did Moshe Rabbeinu graduate to the level of Zeh? Once the Torah was given and his face began to illuminate, Karan or Panav, from that time on, he saw all the Nevuah crystal clear, and from that point on, he never turned back. Comes the Maral, and the Maral in the Gur Aryeh disagrees vehemently with the Mizrahi. And the Maral says that if Moshe Rabbeinu, the Adoin HaNevi'im, the Rambam says there are 4 fundamental differences between the Nevuah of Moshe and the Nevuah of all the other Nevi'im. We'll just say a few. First of all the other Nevi'im, when the Rebbeinu Shem came to them, they lost all faculties. They collapsed. They just fainted. They cannot physically stand and experience Nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to retain all human faculty while the Rebbeinu Shem conversed with him. And the Rambam delineates the 4 differences between the Nevuah of Moshe and all the other Nevi'im. Says the Maral, Chas v'shalom, to say that there was ever a rookie season in the career of Moshe Rabbeinu. There was no, Moshe Rabbeinu never needed to be initiated. Moshe Rabbeinu never needed, practice or time to get into prophecy. No. When Moshe Rabbeinu became a Navi, he always prophesied on the level of Asbaklaya Hamir. So then the question is, what's that? Koyomar Hashem, why did Moshe Rabbeinu sometimes say Koy? And even more, why was it that Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy was crystal clear, and all the other Nevi'im's Nevuah was somewhat cloudy? Why is that? So the Maral says a very important concept, and that is, there's a difference between the prophecy of Torah and the prophecy of Nevi'im. What do I mean? When Hashem came to Avram Avinu, and Hashem tells Abraham, I am going to destroy Sodom, that's not Torah. That's just the Sodomites happened to have been wicked, and therefore the Rebbeinu Shem needed to respond at that time. Had the Sodomites not been wicked, the Rebbeinu Shem would not have to destroy Sodom. That is not an eternal statement of reality. That was a reaction to a specific action that the Sodomites did, and the Rebbeinu Shem needed to respond in kind. That is not a davar nitzchi. That is not something that perforce exists in reality. It happens to be that that's how the Rebbeinu Shem needed to respond. All the Nevuah of the Nevi'im, it's not Torah, it's not absolute reality, it's the Rebbeinu Shem's particular decision to say a certain thing at a certain time. And therefore, it could be Zeh. Why? It could be Kai. Why? Because Kai just means, this is what the Rebbeinu Shem has chose to say. It doesn't mean it had to be. It is because the Rebbeinu Shem decided to react that way under those circumstances. That is Nevuah. However, Torah is different. Torah is absolute reality. We would eat matzah, it doesn't matter what the Mitzrayim would have done. Matzah's reality of creation. The Torah existed before the world was created. All the prophecy to Moshe Rabbeinu is not Nevuah, it's Torah. And Torah is the reality of existence. And therefore, Torah has to be absolute. There's no haziness, there's no cloudiness. Torah is Zeh. Zeh means it exists perforce inherently in creation. So, you'll ask, so why sometimes does Moshe Rabbeinu say Kai? Because not every word the Rebbeinu Shem said to Moshe Rabbeinu was Torah. If Hashem tells Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemar, Tzav Esmei Yisrael, V'yichali Truma, that's Torah. But if Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, tell Paro I'm going to kill the firstborn, that's not Torah, that's a Nevuah, like Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, and Yechezkel. That's the Rebbeinu Shem's particular reaction to a specific event. So that's not absolute reality. That's the Rebbeinu Shalom's communication because he decided to. The difference between Koi and Zeh is not so much in their level of clarity, but in their absolute reality and existence. Torah is absolute existence. Nevuah is the decision of Hashem. A decision is contingent. Torah is not contingent. Torah is absolute. Zeh means absolute. Kai means contingent. Therefore, their word time, not every word Hashem said to Moshe was Torah. Some things Hashem said to Moshe the same way he would speak to Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, and Yecheskel. That's how the Maral deals with this issue.
Menorah is the same way? That's what was with Lashon.
So what?
By Menorah, it was the same Lashon.
By Menorah, it's Zeh, right?
Yeah, but there wasn't there a problem, right?
V'zeh ma'aseh ha'menorah. So there too, it was in terms of the construction of the menorah was a chelek of Torah. So you'll say that was also an absolute reality that's how you have to make the menorah. Okay. So here we have this idea that Moshe Rabbeinu prophesies v'asbaklarya ha'me'ira. Yeah, but like, why is this the first time that the Rebbeinu Shalom is letting us know that Moshe Rabbeinu prophesies? Why is everyone so tired? Were you on a plane the whole day? Yeah. Why Parshas Matos? This is the first in Sefer Shemais. We don't find that the Rebbeinu Shalom is enunciating the principle that Moshe Rabbeinu prophesies Asataya Mira. Vayikra also. We don't find the Rebbeinu Shalom. Why do we have to wait Davka to Sefer Bamidbar, the end of the Sefer? And with which mitzvah does the Rebbeinu Shalom enunciate the principle that Moshe prophesies Asataya Mira? With the mitzvah of Nedarim. Why does the Rebbeinu Shalom choose the mitzvah of Nedarim to enunciate this principle that Moshe Rabbeinu prophesies Asataya Hamira? So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in the Emes Yaakov offers a brilliant thought about the location of why the Rebbeinu Shalom chooses this junction to teach me this idea. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin on Daf Peitas that Ein Shnei Neviim Misnaveim B'Signon Echad. No two prophets will prophesy in the same terminology. So they have different styles. Yeshaya has his style. Yecheskel has his style. In fact, the Gemara says that Yehoshaphat, when he heard the Nevi'im of Achav say the exact same thing, he knew they must be lying. Because two Nevi'im would never prophesy in the same vein. So as Rabbi Yaakov, you would think pink fakert. If it's all coming, if it's all emes la'amita, if it's all coming from the Rebbeinu Shalom, then they should all be saying it in the same niggin. And if they're not, maybe then it's obviously not nevuah emes. Says Rabbi Yaakov, Chazal tell us that the same way no two people have the same facial features, so too nobody has the same attitudes and mindset as anybody else. Everybody has different ways of looking at things. For example, you ask two people, is Yankel rich? You say, you're never going to get the same answer to that. Ruvain is a multi-billionaire. So Ruvain's going to say, Yankel, he's okay. He's paying the bills. And Shimon is an ani guy. So Shimon's going to say, Yankel is an usher muflag. It's all relative to your own personal financial standing. Says Rabbi Yaakov, it's the same thing with Nevuah. No two Nevi'im will ever express prophecy in the same way. Yes, they both have a vision, but in terms of the way they are able to relay it, every Navi is going to relay it based on his personality and attitudes and opinions. However, Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, he could not be subjective in the way he gave over the Torah, because otherwise people are going to say, what? I'm doing a mitzvah now, and this is how Moshe interpreted the mitzvah. This is Moshe's take on the mitzvah. So Moshe Rabbeinu was the only Navi who was able to know exactly to the T what the Rebbeinu Shalom said without any subjectivity, without any personal additions or interpretation. But now we encounter a problem. Because all of a sudden, if Moshe tells us to put on tefillin, so we say, Moshe, we accept what you're saying, that this is exactly what the Rebbeinu Shalom said. You did not add your take on it. And when Moshe Rabbeinu tells us not to speak Lashon Hara, so we say, Moshe, we accept that this is exactly what Rebbeinu Shalom told you. You're not changing it one iota. But all of a sudden comes the Parsha of Nedarim, and Moshe Rabbeinu says that if a guy wakes up in the morning and makes a neder, that I'm not going to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. Now, Midoraisa, you're allowed to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. Midrabanan, you're allowed to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. It's not even an Indian not to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. And yet this guy woke up in the morning and made a neder not to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. He's not allowed to eat Kellogg's cornflakes. So what do we see from here? That sometimes a mitzvah is subjective to the person, that there's an element of subjectivity to Torah mitzvahs. Here you could have a guy, he wakes up in the morning, he makes a neder, he's going to come a half hour early to Shachas. No chiyuv d'oraisa to come a half hour early to Shachas. But this guy has a chiyuv d'oraisa now to come a half. What do you mean? Now all of a sudden the Torah is different for this guy? Now the Torah is subjective. That a person can make personal preferences. Torah now all of a sudden is like a cell phone. You could have personal choices in how the Torah is deals with you. I could aser cornflakes. I could be mechayiv myself to do certain things, and it's only going to be nogei me, not to anybody else. The Torah is subjective. Now a person might think, well, if the Torah is subjective, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is adding a little bit of subjectivity then to the way he's relaying what the Rebbeinu Shalom told him. Meaning until now, the Torah has been black and white. Everybody is Torah achas and mishpat echad yiyah lachem lager. The Torah is uniform to everybody. All of a sudden now it comes to the Parsha of Nedarim, and now we see the Torah is dependent on some whimsical desire or action that a person has. So at this juncture in time, when a person might think, well, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu was adding an iota of subjectivity to the interpretation of the mitzvahs, this is where the Torah chooses to enunciate. Zeh hadavar that Moshe is misnavi b'aspaklaria meira. This is exactly what the Rebbeinu Shalom told him. Avada, the Rebbeinu Shalom told him exactly tefillah and mezuzah. That's a uniform mitzvah to all of Klal Yisrael. But now, for the first time, where a mitzvah could possibly be subjective, so now the Torah has to clarify Zeh hadavar.
What about Nazirs?
What about Naziros? Well, it comes out very good, says Rabbi Yaakov, that there's one other time that it says Zeh, by Shchutei Chutz. What's Shchutei Chutz? That a person happens to wake up in the morning and say, hey, Elsie! You're going to the Mikdash, Elsie. And all of a sudden, Elsie becomes a Davar Kadosh. And if you shecht Elsie outside in your backyard, you're Chayiv Misa. Wait a second. You know, you've been milking Elsie the last 50 years, and she's just a cow. And all of a sudden now she's like a Sefer Torah. Who decided Elsie should become like a Davar Kadosh? You did! Oh, now it's subjective? Zeh hadavar. That's what the Torah says by Shchutei Chutz. Zeh hadavar. So you want to say by Nazirus? Maybe you could say Nazirus also is somewhat uniform because anybody could create Nazirus. And the Nazirus is also a uniform type of Isser. In other words, if you say Harei Alai Nazir, then it's 30 days and it's wine. And in other words, it's not a cookie cut type of Isser to the Nazir. Meaning any person who says Harei Alai Nazir, there is a preordained halachic mode of Nazirus as opposed to a neder. You can make any form or type of neder. I could say I'm not going to eat cornflakes for 2.5 days. You know, it depends on what I personally say. Okay.
Kosher animals.
What?
Kosher animals.
What about?
Torah says Zut hachaya asher tochlu.
Okay, here. Okay, I hear. The focus here is on the way that Moshe says Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem. So it means Moshe is saying Zeh in context of the word of Hashem. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Nedarim for a moment. Is it a good idea to make Nedarim? When should a person, or let's talk about Chumras in general. You know, a Chumrah is an extra stringent practice. Is a Chumrah a good thing? So it's the rest of Klal Yisrael, they're not keeping chumras. So let's say an individual wants to take upon themselves a chumrah. What are the guidelines? What are the restrictions? What are the parameters of a chumrah? So there's an interesting pshat from Rabbi Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer, who says like this. He says, how often do we see a guy come into shul, he opens up the siddur, and he starts saying Matoivu, and he starts saying Beis Karbonos, and he starts saying all the different tefillos, tchinos, and bakashos, and he completely blew the boat. He messed up the whole shachos. Why? Because it's not considered davening with a minyan unless you start Shemana Esrei with the tzibur. Yeah, but then I can't say this added thing in the siddur, that added thing, so don't say it. But the main thing is to start Shemana Esrei with the tzibur. Yeah, but then I'm not going to be able to say all these, Kabbalistic prayers. Nobody asks you to say it. Just follow the Shulchan Aruch. Start Shemana Esrei with the tzibur. If you don't start Shemana Esrei with tzibur, it's not considered davening with a minyan. But people have a certain need to do more than the halacha requires. Why? Because it makes you feel good about yourself. Because I'm not just a regular person, I'm a besser mensch. But it's a tremendous danger. Because when a person feels they're a besser mensch, then they very often cut out the meat and potatoes. There's a concept that a person only has a limited amount of ability. A person's ability is not infinite, so you have to make sure you don't waste and expend your energy on a chumrah and use it up. And instead of, are you learning every day? Are you davening with a minyan? There are certain things which are absolutely chiyuvim. So to expend energy on things which are only a chumrah is wrong. So the Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer teaches a pasuk. Yachel devarai. If you keep what Hashem tells you, you have to do, then kachal hayotz mi piv yasa. Then we could start worrying about making nadarim and taking care of extra legal practices. But until you're keeping the meat and potatoes, until you do what the Shulchan Aruch says, you should not do chumras. Not only do you not have to do chumras, it's wrong to do chumras. It's misplaced. It's not balanced. It's not healthy. In fact, Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh says on the Mishnah Perkos, "V'lo am ha'aretz chassid." What does it mean, "V'lo am ha'aretz chassid"? It says Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, everyone, human nature is to try to accept upon themselves chumrais, milsa de chasidus. Says the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, the problem is if you don't know basic halacha, then not only are chumras not a good thing, they will remove you and take you away from Avodas Hashem. He gives a very interesting example. He says, people who get caught up in saintly behavior will say, well, al pi Kabbalah, marital relations are supposed to be on a Yom Kadosh, Friday night. Avada, maybe the best time to do it is Yom Kippur. Shaita Shabbat, it's Isser Dairaisa on Yom Kippur. Yeah, but if you're not Ma'aretz, you don't know. You just get caught up in fads, in these things that everybody's doing. So says Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, don't get caught up in fads. Make sure you know the Shulchan Aruch. Make sure you know the halacha. Again, the point is not that I'm not saying. Listen carefully. Make sure you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you're not required to abide by chumras. I'm saying it's not good to do chumras. Why? Because unless you're keeping the basics, then it's unhealthy and it will take you away from Avodas Hashem. Because then you feel it's a self-inflated, empty feeling of fake Avodas Hashem. Okay, if you don't like it, what can I tell you? Let's see two more things at the end of the Parsha. Parak Lamed Aleph Pasuk Ches. Let's come back to Bilam. Parak Lamed Aleph Pasuk Ches. So all of a sudden, the Torah tells us again about Bilam Harasha. Where in the world did Bilam Harasha come from? So it says this: Malchei Midyan Hargu Achal. They killed the kings of Bilam, the kings of Midyan. Es Aviv, Es Rakem, Es Sur, Es Chor, Es Reva. Chamesh es Malchei Midyan. Ve'ez Bilam ben Ba'ar Hargu Bechoreb. They killed Bilam. What do you mean they killed Bilam? Anybody know Bilam's address? No? If you put in, Bilam into your GPS, where is it going to take you? Midyan. Bilam doesn't live in Midyan. Aram. You're Nachar. Pesaira. So what do you mean they killed the Malchei Midian and Bilam ben Mar? What Bilam vacations in Midian? That's Bilam's, go-to vacation area. What's Bilam doing in Midian? So that's Rashi's kasha. Says Rashi, Bilam halach sham. Bilam went there. Lito schar esrim v'arba elef. Bilam said, "Show me the money. Look, you hired me to knock off the Jewish people. I was pretty successful. 24,000 slain. I would say that's a pretty solid day of work," says Bilam. "I think you got to pay up." Shehipo miso about sasai. Okay, so Bilam went to Midian to collect money from Midian. Then Rashi says Bilam then went out to Klal Yisrael and he said, "What are you going to mess around with Midian? 600,000 Jews couldn't handle Midian, and now the Klal Yisrael sent out an army of 12,000 people to attack Midian." Bilam said, "You couldn't even handle Midian when you were 600,000. Now you're going to handle them when they're 12,000?" So when Bilam was there collecting his money and telling Klal Yisrael, "You're going to lose the war," so we killed Bilam. Targum Yonasan ben Uziel says the whole Maisa that when Bilam saw Pinchas, Bilam said some kishuf, and he flew up on his broom, and then Pinchas used the tzitz, and he also flew after Bilam, and he killed Bilam using the Shem HaMefarish. But be it as it may, Bilam was in Midian. What was he doing there? He was collecting money from Midian, because Midian hired Bilam to knock off Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi say, what does Rashi mean? Bilam was going to collect money from Midian? Midian never hired Bilam. Midian has nothing to do with Bilam. If you remember in Parshas Balak, what happened? Balak sent the Ziknei Midian and the Ziknei Moav to hire Bilam. And the first night that Bilam said, "You know what, let me ask God," so Rashi points out, the Ziknei Midian said, "This guy's never going to come." So they left. The only people who had faith that maybe they would be successful in commissioning Bilam was the Ziknei Moav. And then the Ziknei Moav were successful and they hired Bilam. So Bilam was not hired by the Ziknei Midian. Bilam was hired by the Ziknei Moav. So what does Rashi mean? Bilam went to Midian to collect his money. Also, nobody promised Bilam money other than Balak himself. The pasuk says that Balak was menader to give money to Bilam. He said, "Al nos simana me haloi chelai ki chaber achaber chamaoid vayamar Balak al Bilam haloi shalosh av yilachal lekroilach lama lahelach liyimi ha'umnam lo yuchal kabdecha." And another question asks Rabbi Leo Mizrahi. Number one, what's Bilam doing in Midian? Bilam was never hired by Midian. Bilam was hired by Balak. Why is he not going to Balak to collect his money? So Mizrahi says like this. Who was the one who gave Balak Eitzah to go hire Bilam? So the Psukim say, Midian told Balak that this guy knows what he's doing. So the Midianim were the Shadchim between Balak and Bilam. They were the ones who told Balak to go hire Bilam. So now Bilam is going back to the Midianim and saying, "What's going on? You recommended me, so you have to take financial responsibility to make sure they pay me. Either you pay me or you get the money from them. That's how it works in business. If you're going to recommend someone and you're going to tell someone, this guy he could do the job, so now they have assumed financial responsibility to make sure that either they pay the money or they make sure that the Moav pays the money." It's interesting, Rabbi say, that the Maskal LeDavid, by Rav David Pardo, says something very interesting. Remember we asked the question, who comes from Balak? Rus. So remember we had the question of the Maharit. Somebody sent me an email, he doesn't understand the question. It's a Maharit's question. The question is, what's the whole business? Moavi, V'loi Moavia. One second, Rus doesn't come from Moav. Rus comes from Midian. Rus is a descendant of Balak. Balak is from Midian, because Rashi says, Balak ben Sipar, Melech LaMoav, V'esahi, that he was only the king of Moav at that time. Really, he was from Midian, but Moav was stuck without a king, so they took Balak out of Midian and they appointed him temporarily the king of Moav. But Rus was not a Moavia, she was a Midyani. Says the Maskell of David, listen carefully. Balak was a king really originally of Midian. But Moav didn't have a king, so Balak ben Sipar Melech Moav Ba'isahi. And after the episode, he went back to his native country, and he continued being what he always was, king of Midian. Therefore, if Bilam wants to collect his money, where's he going to go? Of course he's going to Midian. To who? To Balak. Balak's the king of Midian. He was only Melech L'Moav Ba'isahi. That's why Bilam is going to Midian to collect money from Balak.
And Rus.
Oh, I didn't answer that. It's a good kasha. Rus really comes from Midian, not from Moav. It's a good question. But the answer to that question is for a different time. Okay, let's end with Israeli politics, and we'll call it a night. Okay, so, there was, in the early days of the state, and before, there was the famous disagreement and achlekes between Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Kook as to the attitude to have toward the state and the attitude to have toward the secular Jews who were building the country. And Rav Kook once pointed out that there are two places in Tanakh, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld once pointed out that there are two places in Tanakh where it says the word nachnu. Nachnu, not anachnu, nachnu, which is not a typical way to say anachnu. It says nachnu. First of all, you have at the end of the Parsha, nachnu na'avar chalutzim, and then you have in Eicha, nachnu pashanu marinu. So Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld would say, one pasuk says nachnu by the chalutzim, and one pasuk says nachnu pashanu umarinu, to teach that the chalutzim, the builders of the state, are nachnu chalutzim, but they're also nachnu pashanu umarinu, meaning pointing out the unworthiness of those who are building the state in a secular way. So Rav Kook, legend has it, responded that there's a third nachnu in the Tanakh, and that is kulanu b'nei ish echad nachnu, indicating that regardless of the spiritual status of the chalutzim, but at the end of the day, whether you're Haredi or you're chalutzim, we're all the sons of the same father. In other words, kulanu Yehudim, kulanu b'nei Avinu Sheva Shamayim. So that was the famous machlokes that still reverberates until today. But it was interesting that in one of the inaugurations of the yeshivas in the early days of the state, so Rav Kook invited Rav Itzela Petterberg to participate. Rav Itzela Petterberg had just come to Eretz Yisrael, and he invited Rav Itzela to participate in the inauguration, Chanukah Sabayis of this yeshiva. He invited Rav Itzela to speak, and Rav Itzela was a tremendous anav. He would not speak for Rabbi. So Rav Kook got up to say the following. There's a pasuk in next week's Haftarah, Vatavoyu vatitamu es haaretz. They will come and they will defile the land. And the Navi said, and the Medrash says, Halavai shetavoyu v'titamu es haaretz. God says, if only Jews would come and defile the land. And the point being is, don't be so concerned about the religiosity of the chalutzim and the pioneers of the state of Israel. God yearns for a Jew to come to Israel. It doesn't matter if they observe, it doesn't matter if they keep, it doesn't matter if they're shomer Torah mitzvahs. The Rebbeinu Shem so strongly yearns for the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. Hashem says, "Vatavoyu vatitamu es haaretz halavai shetavoyu v'titamu." If only they would come and be matamei. And at that point, Rabbi Itzela could not contain himself, and Rabbi Itzela Petterberg got up, and he says, "B'mechilas kavoidcha." That's not the meaning of the Medrash. When the Medrash says, "Halavai shetavoyu v'titamu," the Medrash doesn't mean Hashem wishes that they in fact come and defile the land. God says, I wish that they could come and defile the land. But the problem is, Eretz Yisrael is a very sensitive land, and Eretz Yisrael cannot tolerate people being there without observing Shomer Torah mitzvahs, because Eretz Yisrael's nature is that it is vomits out, it expels those who do not keep the Torah. So when Chazal say that Hashem yearns, Vatavoyu vatatamu, halavai shetavoyu vatatamu, it's not that Hashem says, I wish they could come and defile it. Hashem is saying, I wish they would be able to come and defile it. But unfortunately, that is not possible. Eretz Yisrael does not have the tolerance level of absorbing Jews who are not willing to abide by the laws of the Torah mitzvahs. So we should talk to Bizoicha that Nachnu Navor Chalutzim L'fnei Hashem. We should be Zoicha to, during the 3 weeks, the Shlach HaKadosh tells us that the Parshas that we learn during the 3 weeks are very connected to this Zman of the year. And therefore Parshas Pinchas, which talks about La'ila Techolek Yisa'aretz, it talks about the division of Eretz Yisrael. Parshas Matos and Maseh also talks about the distribution of Eretz Yisrael. Is very connected to this time of the year when we hope that we're Zoicha to return to Eretz Yisrael in the proper way. V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfos ha'aretz, and we should talk to Zoicha to see the Bigdin Beis HaMikdash meher b'yameinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.